Let's stand together as we sing this morning. You give life, you are love, you bring light to the darkness, you give hope, you restore every heart that is broken. And great are you, Lord. It's your breath in our lungs, so we pour out our praise. We pour out our praise. It's your breath in our lungs, so we pour out our praise to you only. Second verse, same as the first. You give life. You give life, and you are love. You bring light to the darkness. You give hope, and you restore every heart that is broken. Great are you, Lord. It's your breath in our lungs, and so we pour out our praise. We pour out our praise. It's your breath in our lungs, so we pour out our praise to you only. It's your breath in our lungs, so we pour out our praise. We pour out our praise. It's your breath in our lungs, so we pour out our praise to you only. One voice we sing. Then all the earth will shout your praise. Our hearts will cry. These bones will sing. Great are you, Lord. And all the earth will shout your praise. Our hearts will cry. These bones will sing. Great are you, Psalm 66 says, shout for joy to God. All the earth sing of the glory of his name and make his praise glorious. I love this. It says, say to God, how awesome are your deeds. So great is your power that your enemies cringe before you. All the earth bows down to you. They sing praise to you. They sing the praises of your name. Today as a community, as a people, that's what we want to do. We want to sing of his goodness and his greatness to us today. Sing of that together as we join all of the earth in that. done great things. You've done great things. Oh, hero of heaven, you conquered the grave. You free every captive and break every chain. Oh, God, you have done great things. We dance in your freedom, awake and alive. Oh, Jesus, our Savior, your name lifted high. Oh, God, you have done great things. God, you do great things. Oh, God, you do great things. Sings my soul, my Savior God, to thee. And how great thou art, and how great thou art. And then sings my soul, my Savior God, to thee. How great thou art, how great thou art.
involved here at the end of service. But as always, I want to welcome you and ask you to fill out that Connect card so we can be knowing how to be praying for you and just ways that you may want to get connected as well. Something that we say around here that we're all about, it's our vision statement, is that we want to be a community that connects people to the kingdom of God through a community here on earth, right? So connecting people to the kingdom of heaven through a community here on earth. And so that means that we want to connect you to a lot of things, right? Lots of ways that we can connect you to this community in hopes that that connects you to the kingdom of heaven, right? So we do a lot of things, and we invite you to a lot of spaces where we hope that that's an avenue for that. And so we will be talking more specifically after service, but that's what we're all about here. We want to invite you to be a part of it. As always, I'm at the connection desk after service. Would absolutely love to talk with you and just discuss some ways that you might want to plug in, whether that's through serving, whether that's joining a community group, lots of different options. All right, so come see me after service, but we are just so grateful that you're here. We'll talk more at the end of service, but before we go any further, we want to take some time to say hello to one another. Restoration Kids, you can head on downstairs with Casey.
Glad you're here this morning. Hope you're doing well. And we got a lot to cover this morning. If you would you just stand with me as we read this morning, just kind of the teaching passage we're going to go through. It's out of Matthew chapter 20. So this is going to be the end of where we're going to end up. And I want to start here this morning. So it says, Then the mother of Zebedee's sons came to Jesus with her sons, and kneeling down, asked a favor of him. What is it you want, he asked. And she said, Grant one of these 2 sons of mine, that they may sit at your right and the other at your left in your kingdom. You don't know what you're asking, Jesus said. Can you drink the cup I'm going to drink? We can, they answered. And then Jesus said to them, You will indeed drink from my cup, but sit at my right or left is not for me to grant. These places belong to those whom they have been prepared for by my Father. When the 10 heard about this, they were indignant with the 2 brothers. And Jesus called them together and said, You know that the rulers of the Gentiles lord it over them, and their high officials exercise the authority over them. Not so with you. Instead, whoever wants to become great among you must become your servant, and whoever wants to be first must be your slave. Just as the Son of Man did not come to be served, but to serve and give his life as a ransom for many. This is the word of the Lord, and you get to respond. Thanks be to God. Amen. You can be seated. So I don't know if you've ever really spent time in any form or fashion where you've really thought about, again, kind of the 12 and the tribe, the people that are with Jesus, the people that he calls together. We've talked about it before at length, and I think today it's an important thing for us to understand as we address the mess, as we kind of look at this idea, that there's a mess. The church, the community of believers, it is a mess. It's actually supposed to be. I think it's by design. I don't think it's an accident, and we're part of that mess. Welcome to the mess today. I'm so glad you're here for this mess. And so as we go through this, I want you to kind of have that in mind. I don't know, a few years ago, I was working at a church, and our pastor always had these ideas where he's like, we should try this or that. And it was always kind of like these big, outlandish, extravagant ideas. And one of his ideas was we should talk about the Last Supper. And he was like, what if we got 12 young men to come sit around a table and actually do a tableau of the Last Supper? Now, we had 4 services a weekend at our main campus. And so these 12 guys, these 12 young men, would have to come sit at a table and just eat. And I know that sounds like it's not hard to do, but after the first service where you're sitting for about an hour just eating in front of people, there comes a place where you're like, do we have to do this another time? Like, are we really going to do another service of just sitting and eating for another hour? And yes, you had to. And so they would just come sit and they would eat. And it was like this whole tableau behind our pastors. He would speak. There would be these 12 guys, this huge table. And we had built these benches around the table so they could all be seated there. We had people make food so they could eat breakfast in the morning. They had dinner at night. There was food all around the table, and they're sitting there just eating as he would talk. And then he would speak about the Last Supper painting, and they would all freeze. Then he would come over and explain the painting, and then he would be done with that, and he would come back over. Now, this was all going fine until apparently they'd had too much to eat. And by the 11 o'clock, our last service on Sunday morning, suddenly the guy at the end of the bench just breaks underneath him. And there is this pile up that happens of all the guys just sliding down the bench and leaning on him. And he's trying to push them off. And now there's like this whole mess happening behind our pastor. So they're trying to keep it together while trying to look natural. Instead, they end up just kneeling at the table for about the next 40 minutes. They were not happy with me, like not happy at all. How did we get stuck with this assignment? Now, I don't know if you've ever like had this mess happen where there's things like this. If you think about this painting itself, it's kind of a mess. This idea, this Last Supper, this moment that we sometimes see as this beautiful tableau. If we're being honest, Jesus with his followers, it's a mess. There's a mess happening. I don't know if you've ever seen The Last Supper. I got a chance to see it a few years ago in person in Milan. Now, if you've ever experienced The Last Supper, it's not like a painting that's hanging in a museum somewhere. It's not a small painting. It is hanging in a convent. It's about 15 feet high and 29 feet wide. It's enormous. It's the dining room of a convent in Milan. In fact, I have a few pictures. I'll just take you on this little journey with me. This is the convent that it is in. These are, again, you're here for my vacation slides, I know. And so this is the convent that it's in as you see it and as you get closer. Again, this is the front of the convent. It doesn't look like much. It's not like a super fancy place. It's still a working convent. There are still nuns that live there and come in and eat every single day. And what it looks like inside the room itself, if you're in the dining room, this is how big it is. You can see people standing beneath it, but it's 29 feet across. And when it was being painted by Da Vinci, he went in and he painted this as actually like a faux tableau type of thing. What he was doing when he was painting it is he used a fresco style, which, as you find out later, a fresco should have never been used on a wall. It's not made for that. It's made for a canvas. And so every year they have to come in and retouch it, like considerably, because he really did the wrong thing. But he's Da Vinci and he gets to do what he wants. You know what I mean? So like, it was fine. He painted for 3 years. It took him 3 years to finish this painting. He was not known for being the quickest painter. And so he took 3 years to finish it. What's great is this is on one wall of the convent and of the dining room. It used to be a dining room. They no longer eat in this room, but it was designed to be one side of this convent. Now, on the other side of the convent walls, just so you know, in the dining room, there's another painting on the other wall, and it's pretty. I think it's really nice. Nobody cares. Nobody looks at that one at all. Everybody's only focused on the Last Supper. Nobody pays any attention. But it's interesting because what's happened in this painting, there's obviously perspective things. There's things that are beautiful about it. There's things that as art lovers you would take apart and understand about it. But even in the painting, there's things that Da Vinci did that were specifically designed to not just be a painting in the past, but a painting now. It was designed to be a place where you would feel like you were eating, and while you were eating in this mess hall or in this cafeteria, you were actually sitting with, that you were part of the painting itself. If you take a closer look, this is like a touched up photo, obviously, but you've seen these, right? This is the one that you buy on Amazon or whatever if you want this hanging somewhere in your house. This is what it looks like, right? And we kind of know the story of what's happening. It's believed that this is the moment that Da Vinci was trying to capture, the moment that Jesus at the Last Supper told his 12 followers, "One of you will betray me." And that it's believed that this is the reaction to that. Everybody's reactions to that moment of one of you will betray me. And so if you go from the left to the right, you have, there's Bartholomew out on the left. He's like way far out there. And then next to him is James the Lesser. Remember, there's two Jameses. James I. I'm not, the plural of James, it might be James I, I'm not sure. There's two Jameses. And so this is James the Lesser is the first one we run into. And then the next one next to him would be Andrew. Andrew's one of my favorite disciples. I just love that he's always the bringer. He kind of brings people to Jesus. And then we have kind of next to him, so there's kind of that next three in a clump. And they're all the closest to Jesus. So in there we have John, we have Peter, who is, interestingly enough, is actually kind of, Peter's the one, he's kind of over the shoulder there, and there's some whispering going on, and he's talking to John. And so John is the one right next to Jesus, if you remember the Da Vinci Code, which is absolutely fictional, just so we are clear about this from this painting. If you've ever read the Da Vinci Code, which I have, if you haven't read it, it's a fun book. But John, this V situation here, that's not what Da Vinci was doing. But anyways, this whole moment here, John is the youngest. He looks very, very young. He's right next to Jesus because why? John is the one that Jesus loved. And the other ones were fine, I'm sure. They were okay with Jesus, right? And so John's right there. Now on the other side, there's a group there that's really, really pretty interesting to me. This other side, when we get into the next side. So right next to Jesus, you see a guy with his finger up like this. That's Thomas, and he's very serious. It's believed that this is supposed to be the finger that we see playing out when Thomas touches the nail holes in the hands of Jesus later. That's what that's supposed to represent. And then as Thomas is there, the person holding everybody back right next to him, that's James the Greater. And then next to him is Philip. And then next to Philip, as you go out a little bit, this is my favorite group out here. So as you go out a little bit, you have Matthew in blue. Matthew's the guy in blue who's kind of pointing over to Jesus. Then you have Thaddeus, and then the last guy there is Simon the Zealot, sitting at the end of the table. Now that group right there would be a real fun group, and we're going to get into why today. Now what's interesting is in this painting we see a little bit of chaos happening. What we don't see is we don't see kind of the thing behind the thing. Like if we're being honest, this group, we see them as like one united front when we look at it. We see them as always being in sync with one another, always being the same people. We lack the idea that there is a diversity of opinion in this group, that there are people that have differing thoughts and views on the world within this group. There are people in this that they will fully disagree across the board in their walk with Jesus in the way that it's supposed to be. They're going to disagree consistently. This isn't just a unified group the way we think of. Now, they will have lasting legacy. They will have lasting memories together. They will have moments of unity together. There are beautiful things. But really, as we look at it, the main thing we actually see is that they are not all a uniform group. It may look like that from the picture, but it's not supposed to be that way. So what we want to look at today as we go through this, what I want to kind of walk through is this picture of community, of the church itself, the mess that it is, and why, and maybe the way it's supposed to work, and why it's important to us, why this matters for us. So if you have a Bible, we're going to walk through a few spots in Matthew, the guy in blue. We're going to walk through his book, and we're going to look at kind of what he talks about as Jesus picks up disciples. So let's start, and what we're going to do is we're going to start in Matthew chapter 4, the first people that Jesus calls to be disciples, this first section of the group that he picks up. So in Matthew chapter 4, verse 18, it says this: as Jesus was walking beside the Sea of Galilee, he saw two brothers, Simon called Peter and his brother Andrew, and they were casting a net into the lake, for they were fishermen. Come, follow me, Jesus said, and I will send you out to fish for people. At once they left their nets and followed him. Now remember, this is a huge statement. What's happening here, we don't have to get into all the logistics. Remember, Jesus is, first of all, looking at people who are not good enough. These are people that should not have been disciples. At this stage of their life, if they were good enough to be disciples, they would have been picked up by a rabbi. They would have been first-round draft picks or whatever. Last night, Ken was showing me a meme of a guy who just got drafted this week by Tampa Bay. I don't know if you've seen this guy. He got picked up by the Buccaneers in the second round. When he went to college, he was a lot thinner, and he was a tight end. And apparently, he lived it up in college. And after college, he came out about 80 pounds heavier, and he is now a lineman, not a tight end, and he's missing his two front teeth, and even his signature. Before you could read it, it was well written. Now it's just like like it looks like he's having a stroke as he writes it, and anyways. I think he's had some head trauma, but welcome to Tampa Bay, man. Like you're in the right spot. You're welcome here. And so like these guys would have been that draft pick. Like you're not the best guy, not the top of the line. These are guys that missed the calling of the draft. In fact, at this point in their life, anybody who was qualified to be a draft pick would have been picked. A rabbi would have come along and said, follow me, and they would have already chosen that. The fact that they are fishing shows us that they did not get chosen, but in fact they go back to their parents' way of living, their parents' jobs, which was fishing, and they now fish. And Jesus comes along and picks people that have been picked over. He picks people that were not good enough and he says, come follow me. And he says, and I will send you out to fish for people. Now, again, this is an idiom of the first century. Just so you know, Jesus is not like have bad dad jokes where he's like, I saw you fishing for fish. Now you can fish for people. It's not, he's not making a bad joke here. Jesus is way cooler than that. It is an idiom that was used a lot by rabbis specifically to talk about fishing for people. It meant like that you will captivate your generation. You're going to be interesting to people. You're going to hold a room. I will make you that kind of person to people that were nothing like that. And at once they left their nets and they followed him. They just go. Now notice the next thing that happens right after that, very next verse. So it says, going on from there, he saw two other brothers, James, son of Zebedee, and his brother John. Zebedee's such a great name, isn't it? And they were in a boat and with their father Zebedee, preparing their nets, and Jesus called to them. And immediately they left their boat and their father, and they followed him. Now, here's what I want you to see. More than the quality of the people that Jesus is picking up, although that's important, I also want you to see the quantity of the people Jesus is picking up. Did you notice right off the bat, how many people does Jesus call to follow him? He doesn't start with one. He starts with two brothers. And the next set he picks up, it's two more brothers. Following Jesus cannot be done alone. Just going to say it. It doesn't seem as though he wants people to do this alone. He starts off with a pair of people. There's never just one follower. There's always at least two. And he picks up people for this reason. He starts with this quantity, saying, I want brothers, and he pulls two brothers for this reason. Now, there's some really interesting stuff, and I think this is where we live today. If you've ever read, and let me just do it, I'm going to warn you, this is going to be a rant. Maybe not even like preaching. This is just a rant of my feelings. One of the things that we see in American culture is this individualism. If you've ever read Tribe, Sebastian Junger takes this apart really brilliantly. But what he writes about is in the 1700s, as America is being founded, there is this happening of trafficking people from one culture of the Europeans that had settled America to the natives that were here already, right? The people that were here. There was two groups. And what's interesting is people were leaving one group and going to the other. People were crossing groups, and right, there would be people that were trying to become part of another group. And what's interesting is in all the writings we have of that time, there is not a single account of a person willingly leaving a native tribe here and becoming one of the European settlers. Only the other way. Happened over and over and over again. In fact, Benjamin Franklin, there's some quotes by Benjamin Franklin where he writes about this. He talks about how people, he said this, they tried to go get people out of the native tribes and say, come back to being a European settler. And it says, though ransomed by their friends and treated with all imaginable tenderness, they become disgusted with our manner of life and take the first good opportunity of escaping again into the woods. Like they just keep leaving here. Thousands of Europeans are, and I know this is not kosher anymore, but are Indians, and we have no examples of even one of those Aborigines having from choice becoming European. There must be something in their social bond, something singularly captivating and far superior to anything boasted of among us. That's by Crèvecoeur, which I know it sounds super fancy, but Crèvecoeur. He writes this same thing around that same time. There's not a single person coming to be one of the European settlers. Everybody's going to be something else. And there must be something about that that is attractive. And what their theory is the thing that's attractive about it is the bond that they create. That there's a communal form, and Europeans are known for their rugged individualism. And that's the world we live in today. Right, we see this if we read anything that's happened really in any literature, but Alexis de Tocqueville, as he writes about the settlement of America, he writes that rugged individualism is the lifeblood of the American way. And he also writes, it may also cause the abolition of humanity itself. So it's both. It's the way that Americans were wired, but it's also could be the downfall of all of humanity, is the rugged individualism we live in. And we've kept it in check. America kept it in check right up until about World War II. And right after World War II, we start to see urbanization that really starts to take full manifestation in America. And urbanization, as we move kind of from urbanized areas to suburbanized areas, we start to see all these things start to shift. And what's interesting as we do that is we start to see the loneliness epidemic take over. We think what happens is isolation is what we fall into instead of individualism. Individualism gives way to isolation. Some of us in this room, I know we're introverts. Anybody else an introvert? Anybody else? I'm the only one? Yeah, introverts, it's okay. We don't raise our hands. Right? I get it. That's not how we're wired. I'm an introvert as well. And there's a part of us that like, we kind of see it as this thing where like, okay, like for some of us, I've talked with people who are extroverts and they will not use, if they're alone, sometimes they don't call it, like for me, if I'm alone, I call it solitude. It's like, it's a time to be alone. For some of my friends who are extroverts, they call that isolation because they're like, it's terrible. They hate it, right? And that's okay. But the reality is we move from individualism, which was the kind of the foundation, to isolationism, which is not good. And it created the loneliness epidemic. If you're not familiar with that, we are living in the loneliest generation we've ever been in. Studies show that we are lonelier than ever in humanity right now, especially Gen Z. Gen Z is predicted to be the loneliest generation that's ever walked the face of the planet, which is interesting because you'd think we're more connected than ever. In fact, in 2018, if you're not familiar with this, over in the UK, Prime Minister Theresa May, she appointed a minister of loneliness because the epidemic was becoming so pervasive in their culture that they found that there actually was a problem. And in fact, it wasn't just causing problems socially, but it was causing problems personally. It takes a toll on the American or the person's health. Anybody's health is actually affected by this. There are studies right now showing that people are lonelier than ever right now. So back in 1992, right around the fall of the Berlin Wall, right around that time, as we look at the end of the Cold War, we start to see things where people were only about 2% of people would say that they were lonely. That number right now is about 35% of people who would say that they are actually lonely. In the last few years, most people would say, in that 1992 study, people would say that they had an average of 3 confidants. You know how many the average person has now? 0 confidants. They have 0 people they trust in. In the last year, only about 10% of Americans have talked to their neighbor. 10% have talked to their neighbor, like the person that actually lives next to them. We're lonelier than we've ever been. We're isolated. We've moved from, again, being individualism to isolationism. And in fact, Forbes just did a study on this a few years ago that found that loneliness has the equivalent health value of smoking 15 cigarettes a day. That actually takes a toll on the body in the same way. And you know this. If you know anybody who is elderly and they are alone, what does it do to them physically? What does it do to their bodies? There's a whole thing. If you see a child who is lonely and they're not brought up, developed around other people, what happens to their physical bodies? And right now, Forbes even, this is Forbes magazine. This isn't like this is about business and things. And they're writing that right now, 15 cigarettes a day is what the equivalency of loneliness does to the body. I mean, it really takes a toll on us. We don't even seem to understand it. Dr. Vivek, who was the Dr. Vivek Murthy, he was the American Surgeon General for 4 years. And actually, in his writing in Harvard Business Review a few years ago, he wrote this in Harvard Business Review. He said, this is a Surgeon General. During my years caring for patients, the most common pathology I saw was not heart disease or diabetes, it was loneliness. That's how serious this is. This is how serious this has become. And it's happened in our generation. Here's why this matters. Here's why this is important is what happens to loneliness is you would think that counterintuitively that this would set us back in community, that we long for community, and we do. But instead, we get a lesser version. And what we get is not community, we get tribalism. And tribalism is not community. Let me just explain really quickly what the difference is. Community is something where we look at it for what we are for. Community is a group of people together for something. Tribalism is a group together against something. Community is what we love. We collectively love, and we invite people in love. Tribalism is coming together around something we hate. You see the difference? Where God would set people in families is what it says God does. Individualism sets people in tribes. It's this lesser version. It's not as good, and we fall into tribalism instead of into community, which is not what we want it to be. It's not the thing we hoped for. And so we start to see tribalism growing, and I don't know about you. I don't know if you've watched, the news or a channel or any social media, But if you haven't noticed, we're in the tribalism state, aren't we? We connect with people that are against the things we are against more than we connect with people who are for the things we are for. We connect with people who hate the things we hate more than we connect with people that love the things we love. Right? We connect with tribes more than we connect with community. Jesus calls together a group of people and he says, no, this is going to be about what we're for. This is a community. I'm going to call you out of individualism and isolationism. We're going to call people two at a time to get this started because this is going to be a community of what we're for, not the things we're against. It's going to be a place of love, not just hate. And so he calls these two and then two more. He brings in two and two more. And so as he calls them together, I want you to see what happens because not everybody is this accepting. Notice that they drop their nets right away and they walk with him. I want you to see what Jesus is looking for. I'm going to try to explain it the best I can in just a second. But if you flip over with me to Matthew chapter 8. Matthew chapter 8. This is actually the next time that Jesus invites somebody to follow him. And we actually don't know if they do or not. We don't know if this is accepted or not. But Jesus invites somebody to follow them. It says in Matthew 8:18. It says, when Jesus saw the crowd around him, he gave orders to cross to the other side of the lake. Then a teacher of the law came to him and said, teacher, I will follow you wherever you go. Now, listen real quick. Notice a couple things. It's a teacher of the law. Those first guys, they were just fishermen. They weren't what you're looking for. This is a guy that's like good. Like you want this guy. He's a teacher of the law. He's got respect in the Jewish community. He would know his way around the scripture. He would have been the best and the brightest or else he wouldn't have gotten this job. This is the guy you want. And he comes up and he says, teacher, I'll follow you wherever you go. It sounds real good, right? Like he's on board. And Jesus, who is not a good salesman, Jesus, by the way, terrible salesman across the board, does not cater to the guy, does not like fold, which you would think he'd be like, yeah, okay, cool. He replies right off the bat. He says, well, foxes have dens and birds have nests, but the Son of Man has no place to lay his head. Now, again, this is a government statement in many ways. He's probably talking about Herod specifically. He calls Herod a fox more than once. And he's saying like, well, the government has like their dens. And then he says the birds have nests, probably talking about Rome, the war eagle. They have their nests because there was a place called the eagle's nest near him. He's probably saying, well, they have their place to live, but guess what? I don't have a place. My kingdom's not of this earth. That's not where I operate. And then he says to him, the Son of Man has no place to lay his head. And so then this other disciple comes up. So he may have failed on that deal, by the way. He may have that guy may have walked away. We don't know what happens. And then another guy walks up right after. Like you would think that would have been enough. Another guy walks up. It says another disciple came to him and said, Lord, first let me go and bury my father. And by the way, this doesn't just mean that his father was dead and you need to go put him in the ground. What this means is my father has not died yet. And so let me go kind of just live out the last remaining days, whether it's a week or whether it's years, we don't know. But it means my father hasn't died yet. And really what he's waiting for, if we're being honest, if you want to get honest about it, is he's saying, I haven't received my inheritance yet. And if I leave now, I don't get that. So let me go make sure that the dad passes on and that he passes on the things I want, and then I'll come follow you, okay? And Jesus told him, follow me and let the dead bury their own dead. Again, not a great salesman, this guy. You would think that he'd be like, hey, like let's work it out. You seem like a good kid. I think we could do something. Let me give you a couple weeks, and then you quit the job you're at, and then, you turn your 2 weeks notice, maybe go, I don't know, help your dad however you have to, of letting him go, and then you should come follow me. We'll have more money that way. It'll be better for everybody. You're a smart person. You'll be great to have on the team. Jesus doesn't do that. That's not what he's interested in. And what's interesting is it never tells us what they did. Like it doesn't say if they made it or not. What Jesus is interested in here is not the qualified. That's not who he wants. What he wants is the committed. As he builds a community, he's looking for people that are committed to that community. For us, that's really hard. We're not wired that way. Let me say this first of all. I don't think Jesus is worried about qualification like that you've done well. And this is just my 2 cents, and I could be totally wrong about this. What I look for, and I've had people actually talk to me about this, like, what are you looking for in people's spiritual growth? What am I looking for in my own spiritual growth? How do I know I'm growing spiritually? Have you ever wondered this, like, by the way, where you're kind of like, am I on the right track? Am I doing this right? Where am I at? The biggest thing that I think Jesus is looking for is what I would call, this is not a biblical term at all. It's called spiritual momentum. So if I were to say, what are we looking for here? And what is a community supposed to do? It's supposed to have spiritual momentum. So if I were to say, and let me just, I should have brought like a whiteboard or something, but let me just try to give you a visual. If I was to say like this right here, let's use the Bible here. This is where God is. This is what God wants for you. This is where he exists. And if I was to say, well, there's a person here and there's a person here, we would all be like, well, that person nearest to that is probably the one with the most spiritual momentum, right? They're closer to Jesus. They're getting it. They're better off. And I would say that's not necessarily true. Because what if I told you this person out here was like out here a week ago? And what if I told you the person who was here has been here for 30 years? I think actually Jesus is more interested in that one that's moving toward, right? Is creating spiritual momentum toward him at a constant speed or at least a consistent speed. And for many of us, we think that we get to a certain spot and that's where we made it. We did it. That's the goal of Christianity, right? Is we get to a certain spot, we get whatever it is, baptized, or we like join a small group and we did it. We're like, whatever it is, we make it to that spot and we're like, we did it. I don't think that momentum ever ends. I think he's looking for people to put on perpetual paths towards him because it's a never-ending goal. And what happens as we do that, he's looking for people that are willing to do that. And I think the best way to do it is in community. What the best way to do is, if you look at it as one ancient philosopher once put it, there's a wagon wheel, and he was saying that God is the hub of this wheel, and the more spokes there are, the more people coming towards that same goal, the stronger the wheel is, right? Like that gives the wheel structure. And it's true, as we continue to move towards that common goal, Jesus is looking for people that will do that together, and that makes a stronger community. It's people that are all on the same path, trajectory to get there, but it takes commitment. If you've ever read Bowling Alone, Robert Putnam's famous book, it was in the 80s, but he wrote Bowling Alone. Anybody, like, if you want to know what it's about, the title is kind of what it's about. Like, anybody part of a bowling league anymore? No. Or like, I don't know, Lions clubs, or, even your Chamber of Commerce, things like that. And he wrote about how specifically those things are dying off. We know that church attendance has been dying since the 1950s. Right now, by the way, it's post-pandemic, the average church attender, I'm talking average, the average church attender across America goes to church 0.4 times a month. 0.4 times a month. That's the average. And you might be like, well, not me. I don't know. Like, and I'm not saying like it's bad. I'm just saying, look at your calendar. Like, it's crazy. Even people that you're like, oh, they're there all the time. They're not there all the time. Nobody is. And he writes about how we've lost this ability, not just in church, but across the board, to commit to anything. We don't commit to anything anymore. We don't commit to Lions clubs. We don't commit to our Chamber of Commerce. We don't commit to our CrossFit or whatever. Although if you do commit to CrossFit, you tell everybody you're committed to CrossFit. You can't keep that to yourself, right? You don't commit to anything anymore because it's just not the way we're wired anymore. Part of it is the advancement of technology. Planning Center, which we use Planning Center here, if you're not familiar with that, like on how to plan our services, who's doing what. Planning Center did a study on it a few years ago of commitment levels to even accepting a request to show up to church to serve or whatever. And they found that those levels continued to drop, especially generationally, that younger generations are less likely to commit. And what they found was not that they were less likely to commit because they're just afraid of commitment or whatever. It's just that the idea of something better coming along. So you're always looking for something better, right? We live in a digital age where you can get a text at any moment that could say, this thing's going on all of a sudden, go do this instead, come hang out with me at this, or this thing just popped up, or you should do this, or the weather is, or whatever. And suddenly you just change your plans all of a sudden because we can do that faster than ever. And so we don't commit to anything because we want to commit to nothing because we might want to commit to something. And that's how we operate now, right? Well, yeah, we should just be committed. Yeah, it's an actual thing in our culture. And what Jesus is looking for is not highly qualified people. He's looking for people that are committed to it. Again, what he tells these two people is nothing about, let me tell you the perks of the job. Let me give you the benefit package. Here's what you're going to love, We have full dental or whatever. I don't know. He doesn't tell them anything. He doesn't even try to sell them on, oh, you will get this everlasting life, or you're going to get one. No, he's like, it's going to be really hard. And if you want to come on right now. Don't go bury your dad. You're not going to have a place to lay your head. It's going to be a tough thing. And I'm looking for people that are committed to it. Instantly, that's what he's looking for. But what's interesting is I don't think you can commit to Jesus. And what he's saying here, if I'm reading it right, is you can't commit to Jesus. And I know this sounds controversial in our culture. You can't commit to Jesus without committing to his community. You don't get to have one without the other. He never meets anybody, by the way, and is like, so you want to follow me? Great. What I want you to do is not follow me. I want you to like just kind of stay on your own, isolated from everybody else around you. Don't get near people. Don't gather with other people that believe like you or that think like that. Don't get together with believers. I just want you to do this in isolation all by yourself wherever you are. This is a radically Americanized idea. I'm not saying it's all bad. Jesus spends moments in solitude, and we'll talk about that later. But the idea that he says, I want you to follow me completely individually, he never says that, not once. He never hands them a Torah, a scroll of the Torah, and is like, just go read this and pray every day on your own. That's how you're going to grow. He doesn't do that. To commit to Jesus is to commit to his community. You can't have one without the other. And I know that that's not an American idea. I know that we have lived through COVID and times where we've had to be separate from each other. I know that we want to be rugged individualists about things. I know that we can go watch somebody on YouTube that preaches better than me or whatever. I get that. I know that we can find other things for this, and we'll talk about that. But I think that the reality is Jesus never encourages that, not once. I don't know why we think that it's so encouraged. Don't know where we get that. That's a cultural idea, not a Jesus idea. Big difference between those two things. And so he keeps going from here. Well, follow me for just a second longer. I promise we'll get there. Chapter 9 is one of my favorite moments in chapter 9. Chapter 9, verse 9, sorry. It says this, as Jesus went on from there, he saw a man named Matthew sitting at the tax collector's booth. Follow me, he said. Jesus, and Matthew got up and he followed him. While Jesus was having dinner with Matthew at his house, many tax collectors and sinners came to eat with them and disciples. And when the Pharisees saw this, they asked the disciples, why does your teacher eat with tax collectors and sinners? On hearing this, Jesus said, it's not the healthy who need a doctor, but the sick. But go and learn what this means. And this comes out of out of Hosea, right out of Hosea. I desire mercy, not sacrifice, for I've not come to call the righteous, but sinners. Jesus shows up to a guy. I want you to see how bad this is. But he shows up to a guy named Matthew. Matthew is a tax collector that's the worst of the worst. He works for Rome. He's literally on the payroll of the bad guy. Like Rome is oppressing the Jews. Rome is taxing the Jews at a high rate. Most estimates say that Jews were taxed at 90% of their income. So think about this for a second. Like I know you just did your taxes and you were thrilled about how much you got to pay. I know you were like super pumped. Imagine 90% of your income is taxed. That's where they were living. They were under full oppression from Rome. And now Matthew, who is a Jew, goes to work for the bad guys. What a traitor. And Jesus calls that guy. And he comes and follows him. And then Jesus goes and continues on from there. I want you to see the whole rundown of everybody. So in Matthew chapter 10, the next page probably for you, Matthew chapter 10, verse 2, it says this. So these are the names of the 12 apostles. So remember, we went through this a little bit, we're going to walk through them. So it says, Jesus called together the 12 disciples, and he gave them authority to drive out impure spirits and heal every disease and sickness. These are the names of the 12 apostles. So first there's Simon, who's called Peter, and his brother Andrew, and James the son of Zebedee, and his brother John. Philip and Bartholomew, Thomas and Matthew the tax collector, James, son of Alphaeus, and Thaddeus, Simon the Zealot, and Judas Iscariot, who betrayed him. Again, pay attention, and as you read this, to the two guys with monikers behind their name. There's two people. There's Matthew, who's a tax collector. He was on the payroll of Rome, one of the most hated people in that area, and would have been the exact opposite of the Jewish culture that he had been growing up in. And then there's another guy with a moniker, the last guy there, right? Verse 4, Simon the Zealot. Simon the Zealot. Again, remember zealots, they were called the Sicarii, which was the dagger men. And they literally would kill people. So they would keep a dagger. They were called daggermen because they would keep a dagger inside their cloak. And at any moment where people were not looking, they would slide through a crowd. And if there was a Roman soldier or even just a Roman sympathizer there, that they disagreed with, they would slide up behind that man and they would slit their throat and slide back into the crowd. There's a whole movie on it recently. I can't remember who was in it. I think it was like Christian Bale was in it or something, called Daggerman. It came out a few years ago about this group of people. They were radicals for the conservative group of Jews that were sick of being oppressed. And so he would slide in and literally slit the throat of people who worked for Rome. What did Matthew do? He worked for Rome. Just imagine how much fun dinner would be with those two every night. Like, just you think you're like getting together with like your in-laws is bad or whatever, because you're like, oh no, we're going to talk politics. Well, guess what they're going to do? Guess what I mean, it would be like, and I know this is like a crazy scenario or whatever, because we don't do this in our culture. But I mean, it would be like if you were like, hey, I don't know, I hear Tucker Carlson's out of work. Maybe he wants to come follow. And let's put Tucker at the table. And then the other person I'm going to call is like AOC or something. I'm going to call in like, or like Joe Biden himself or whatever. And I want you guys just to hang out every single day. You're going to follow me. I mean, I want you to imagine this. This is what it would be. And this is like life and death. This isn't just like a little bit of something. This is a full-on life and death thing. And that's what he brings together in the same group. They do not see eye to eye on everything. They do not have ideologies that are the same. And here's actually one thing I think is important. I think there's a misnomer in church, by the way, is I think that we think that to go to a church, you have to believe every single thing the exact same way as the people in that church, or else it's just not the right place. Have you guys had this experience? Like any little thing that you're like, oh, I don't know about that. It's like, well, I better find somebody who does think the same exact way I do. First of all, you're not going to find them. They don't. There's too many people in this world that think too many different ways. And I would actually challenge that maybe one of the better things about church is when the church does not agree on every single thing, just like the followers of Jesus, but they find a commonality around Jesus himself. They don't get out into the fringes. They stick to the thing that they do have in common, not the things they're against, but the things they're for. And I actually think that's a strong statement of what Jesus is trying to do here. Again, it's the difference between a tribe and a community. Jesus is creating a community that comes together in love and accepts the differences they have, not in hate, and rejects the differences within the group. Jesus puts this group together on purpose. And the last thing I want you to see is just in Matthew 20, where we began this morning as we read. Matthew 20, fun little moment where they try to go back to being like the world and they try to be like a tribe. So this mother's request, Matthew 20, verse 20. The mother of Zebedee's sons came to Jesus and with her sons and kneeling down asked a favor. So remember, she has the two boys there. And he says, what is it you want? And she says, grant that these two sons of mine may sit at your right and the other at your left in your kingdom. And he says, you don't know what you're asking. He says to them, can you drink the cup I'm going to drink? Now, Jesus' cup always means kind of like a suffering, right? It's what he prays at the end of his life. If this cup can pass from me, would you take it from me? He's saying, you don't get it. You don't know what you're asking for. And they said, we can. And Jesus said to them, you will indeed drink from my cup, but to sit at my right or my left is not for me to grant. These places belong to those for whom they have been prepared by my Father. And when the 10 heard about this, that these two guys went and tried to get their mom, by the way, they got their mom involved, and they were like, hey, Mom, can you go talk to Jesus for us? And that mom comes along, and she tries to save the day. And when they hear about that there's now a division among them, that they're trying to be more like a tribe where they kind of separate themselves. The group, it says were indignant with the two brothers. Notice it doesn't say they're two brothers, like they're not brothers anymore, but with the two brothers. And by the way, the word indignant there is a word in the Greek that I'm not allowed to say in a polite setting. I mean, they are angry with them. And then they get upset. Everybody starts to divide in this moment. And Jesus calls them back together. He does not let them divide. He doesn't let them go off into tribes, but he pulls them back together. And he said, you know that the rulers of the Gentiles lord it over them, and their high officials exercise authority over them. Not so with you. Not so with you. I think that's such a huge line. You see how the world operates. You see how tribes are formed. You see what the world does when it's trying to form this individualized version of community, which is tribalism. You see how they are, but he says, not so with you. It's not going to be like that in this group. He calls them out. That's not how you're going to live. You don't get to do that. And he says, not so with you. Instead, whoever wants to become great among you must become your servant. And whoever wants to be first must be a slave, just as the Son of Man did not come to be served, but to serve and give his life as a ransom for many. It's a totally different view. Jesus has a totally different view than the world around him of what community looks like. Now, let me give you just a couple things that I look at as I look at this community that Jesus is building and the differences between that. And this is going to be really quick. I just want to give you a couple things that I notice as I go through this that I think are misnomers and ways that we distort community and make it more like a tribe. First of all, I want you to see that connected is not community. There is a difference between connection and community. We live in a culture right now that is more connected than ever, right? You have a smartphone that connects you to all kinds of things. What it mostly does is give you like 1,000 ways that you can not talk to somebody, by the way. Like, it's amazing how many ways you can be rejected now by somebody by like not hearing from them. You have so many options to not hear from somebody. But it's a connection, it's not community. There is a huge difference between connection and community. Connection is this idea, like it is something that's usually celebrity related. There's a great book out right now called Christian Celebrities. It's very interesting. The idea of a Christian celebrity is somebody who has power over your life without having proximity to your life. And I want you to think about that for a second. We see this happening across our culture, celebrity culture in general, is that there's people that have power over your life without having any proximity to it. That's connection. It is not community. Big difference between those two things. Jenny Odell says that when you pull your phone out, I love there's a book she wrote called How to Do Nothing. It was about how connected we are to our phones. And she writes that anytime when you are with people and you are sitting there just using your phone over and over again, she said, what you're telling the people around you is that they are not enough for you in the moment you're in. That you need something else. They're not enough for you in the moment that you're in. Right? And I think that's something to that because we want to be connected to all these things, but we're not actually in community with anybody. This, by the way, and just so you guys know, I'm not, I know COVID happened. I know a lot of things happened during that. I get that there was a world that changed. I just want to let you know, I do not believe that church is an online situation. I just don't buy it. There are things that you cannot do online that you can only do in person when you know one another and you're in community with one another. They're not the same thing. Don't fall for connection when what we're looking for is community because it stops short and it does not fix the problem. It doesn't actually get us where we want to go. One of the things we lack in that is just, anyways, we can talk about it all day, but the compassion that comes with that. I believe that online stuff like that is just not where we're supposed to be. The second thing, let me just keep moving though, is chemistry. Chemistry is not connection. What we think is there's a romanticized version of community where everybody's like us. So again, like I've talked about before, but like I have a friend. I remember meeting him. His name's Dan, and I remember like Dan. He was wearing the first time I met him. He was wearing a flannel shirt. It was plaid, and he was wearing Toms, and he was a guy that like I saw him and I was like, I think that's the same guy I am. He was like kind of unshaven. He had, and like, I mean, seriously, I was like, it was like looking in a mirror. And like, I was like talking to him. I remember talking to the first time and I was like, and we were talking about music and he was into the same bands I was into. I was like, he said, I love Death Cab for Cutie. I was like, I love Death Cab. And it was like this whole thing. We're like, I can't believe this. And we were talking about books we'd read and he'd read all the Chuck Klosterman books. I'd read all the Chuck. I mean, it was just like, we connected on like we were friends. Like we were very tight and we still are to this day. Dan and I are very good friends. Every time I drive through Tennessee, I go see Dan. I love seeing him. It's great. But guess what? That's chemistry and that's great, but it's actually not community. Because if everybody that I'm looking for is just that same exact person, then there's no community to that. First of all, I'm not going to be learning anything from anyone who's any different than me. Only people who think the same way I do. Only people that do the same things I do. That's not where community is built. It's not built around people that are just like you. Actually, I would say, like, I mean, some of you in this room, I don't know if you know this or not, and I hate to break it to you. We're not all in the same demographics. Some of us are younger than others. Some of us are older than others. Some of us have different backgrounds. Some of us come from different places. Again, I hate to break this to you if you haven't noticed this yet. And that's good. That's the health of a community, not the detriment of the community. Chemistry is not the same thing. It's not the same idea. People that are in my community are not necessarily the people that I'm just exactly like. And I think we run into this idea of like almost like a romanticized version, where it's like everybody's gonna be, we're gonna have like a meet cute with them, we're gonna be adorable together, and we're all gonna get matching tattoos or whatever. Like that's what we picture. That's not what this is. It's not what community is. That is what chemistry is. Last thing I want to say is just real quickly that near is not in community. Near is not in. Sometimes we fall for this idea that we're near something, we're not in it. If you look at the patterns of Jesus' life, you could make the argument that across the board, Jesus is in one of two places. He goes fully into silence and solitude with the Father, and then he goes fully into community with people. He's never just kind of somewhere in the middle. Most of us only live somewhere in the middle. We're terrified to go into silence and solitude. That's real scary for us. We don't go all the way into that. So we take baby steps toward it, where some of us think it's isolation, and some of us are scared of it. Some of us were like, well, I'll do that, but I'll bring my iPhone with me with a TV show playing in the background so that Michael Scott is part of my silence and solitude. I'm still alone, but I need something else with me. We're not fully in it. We're just not all the way out of it either. Does that make sense? We're not in it. And we do the same thing when we're in community with each other. We don't go fully into it. We kind of take these steps toward it, and we're near people we're not connected with. We're not actually in community with those people, though. We're just kind of near them. And do not confuse in for near. They're not the same thing. The pattern of Jesus is to go fully into one or the other. And so many times I think we fall just a little bit short of that. If you read, I went back, if you've ever read through Life Together by Dietrich Bonhoeffer. So he's created a camp. If you aren't familiar with the story, it's very quick. But there was he was in Nazi Germany. The Nazis were coming after specifically the Lutheran church that he was a part of in general. He was a spy on the inside, trying to figure out what the Nazis were doing, coming after people. So he created a camp. And it was a community that he created that was in hiding from the Germans. And he was almost like having to indoctrinate, reprogram people that had been given Nazi propaganda over and over again. And the Nazis were looking for him, and they eventually did kill him for this. But Bonhoeffer, as a pastor, pulled together this community, and he sat them down, and he started to teach in this community. You lived out there on your own, together, like just together in this community. You were hidden from the culture around you, and he was trying to reprogram people from the Nazi propaganda they had been given. And he talks about this idea, and he writes about this, and again, the whole book is fantastic. It's a short read. It's worth reading. But he says, by sheer grace, God will not permit us to live even for a brief period in a dream world. He does not abandon us to those rapturous experiences and lofty moods that come over us like a dream. God is not a God of emotions, but a God of truth. He's talking about community here, these dream ideas, these chemistry ideas. Only that fellowship which faces such disillusionment with all its unhappy and ugly aspects begins to be what should be in God's sight, begins to grasp in faith the promise that is given to it. The sooner this shock of disillusionment comes to an individual and to a community, the better for the both. Like the moment that we realize this is a real thing and it takes work and it takes commitment, that's when it's at its best. A community which cannot bear and cannot survive such a crisis, which insists upon keeping its illusion when it should be shattered, permanently loses in the moment the promise of a Christian community. Sooner or later, it will collapse. Every human wish dream that is injected into the Christian community is a hindrance to genuine community and must be banished if genuine community is to survive. He who loves his dream of community more than the Christian community itself becomes a destroyer of the latter, even though his personal intentions may be ever so honest and earnest and sacrificial. That dream of this idea where we're so close to it, but we're not in it, and we don't want to commit to it. We don't want to be part of a commitment to it. We just kind of float near it on either side. He's saying that dream has to be shattered or else it kills the entire idea of Christian community. It doesn't exist without being fully committed to it. And so if we go back to this moment that we see of these disciples sitting at a table, and we see this picture that we've all kind of seen before, and we think, oh man, what a beautiful picture. And we don't see all the things going on behind the scenes. What I want to show you is that the most important thing about this picture is not just the chaos that's happening within it, the mess that's being created, and the things that we don't understand about it that like aren't shown, of the disagreements and the disgruntledness and the discrepancies between their views. That's not the only thing in this picture. The most beautiful part of this picture to me is actually if you look at where Jesus is and right behind him, the countryside that's behind it was not painted to be a countryside of Israel. It was designed to be the countryside of Milan, right where they were sitting. And in fact, this room was not designed to look like an upper room somewhere in Jerusalem. It was designed to look like a room right where they're sitting in Italy. And they're not sitting on one side of the table just so we can see all of them. It's believed that they're all sitting on one side of the table because the goal is to feel as though you are invited into the table with him. You are invited to the table with these disciples. They've saved room for you and for me. That we are eating with them, that the background is there so that it feels like we are there with them at this time. And the table is set for us to join. The question, like we see with Jesus and these people that come to him, is, are we willing to commit to that? Are we willing to address and follow into this mess that is this community? Or are we scared of that? Are we not going to agree with that? Are we going to fall out of that? What is it going to be for us? Because to accept Jesus is to accept his community. So the goal is not to fall for some kind of idea where it's a clique that's less than a community. It's not to just look for chemistry. The goal is to not just be near it, but to be in it. And he invites us into it. So this morning as we close, I just want to pray over us as a community. And we're just going to close. I'm just going to pray for us, and that's going to be it because I've talked way too long today. I've got a lot more thoughts too, so I'm so sorry. I want to pray for us as we close this morning. And right where you're at, if you would, just where you're at for just a second, would you just put your palms out with me? Would you close your eyes? And first of all, I want you, not me, I want you in your own minds and your own hearts. I want you to picture yourself in a moment where you are being invited into this table. You're being invited into this community. And I want you to see yourself, and I want you to picture yourself, what is your answer to Jesus as he invites you into that? What is it that you answer to him when he invites you into his community? Are you accepting it? Is there a part of you that's nervous about it? Is there a part of you that just is afraid of this commitment? Jesus, we thank you for inviting us into your community. We thank you for your invitation that wasn't just 2,000 years ago, but your invitation today even. We know we live in a world where this flies in the face of our culture. This is, for some reason, one of the hardest things for us to get figured out in our own lives, and I pray that you would help us with that. I pray that the fear we have of being authentic in a community, to connect into a community in a real way, I pray that you would help us to overcome those fears. I pray that you would continue to invite us in even at times where we're reluctant. I thank you for your grace that meets us right where we are, and when we accept to join a community, to be a part of the community that you invited us to, I thank you for the grace that follows that. Doesn't mean we have it all together, it just means that we're following you together. So I pray that as we follow you together as a church, as a community, that you would help us to encourage one another, to spur one another on, that we would be growing closer to you. As we grow closer to one another, we would be spokes on a wheel, making that wheel stronger and making one another better as we move towards Christ-likeness in you. I pray that you would continue to bless this mess, that you would continue to bless the communities that come together, the people that come together that are so faithful to meeting together. I pray you would add to that because of a genuine desire for community, and that we would help to find those people that are out there looking for it right now. We love you, and we thank you for your love for us. We pray you'd help us in every moment to show you how much we love you with our hearts, our minds, our souls, and our strength, and that we'd be kind and loving to those people around us. I pray these things in your name. Amen. Amen. Well, thanks for being here, and hopefully you will get out of here without getting blown away. But yeah, if you have any problems, I guess let us know. We'll try to hold you down or whatever. And we'll see you back here next week as we continue this series. Have a great week.